Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that 99% of every human being on the planet is dead. Not from a bomb, not from a plague, from a single mountain. That's not a hypothetical. Scientists believe it may have actually happened 74,000 years ago, when a supervolcano called Toba detonated with a force that makes almost every eruption since look like a campfire. The sky didn't just darken. It may have stayed dark for years, and when the dust finally settled, some researchers believe our entire species had been crushed down to a population small enough to fit inside a single high school. In this video, we're breaking down exactly what happened the day Toba erupted, how close it may have pushed humanity to total extinction, and the strange evidence hiding in your own DNA that suggests it's true. And by the end, you'll understand why you, personally, might be the descendant of one of the luckiest survival stories in the history of life on Earth. Volcanoes are ranked on something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale that runs from 0 to 8. Most eruptions you've actually heard of in your lifetime sit around a 5 or 6. Toba hit an 8, the maximum rating that has ever been recorded. The explosion would have been heard, felt, and seen from almost impossible distances, a column of ash and pulverized rock punching more than 30 kilometers straight up into the sky, swallowing the sun for anyone within hundreds of kilometers almost instantly. For comparison, Mount St. Helens in 1980, the eruption that flattened forests and dominated global news for weeks, released about 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba was thousands of times larger. The explosion was so violent it didn't just blast material into the sky, it caused the ground above the magma chamber to collapse entirely, carving out a crater that later filled with water to become Lake Toba, the largest volcanic lake on the planet. Ash from this single eruption has been discovered in marine sediment cores as far away as India and the eastern coast of Africa, thousands of kilometers from where it happened. This wasn't a regional disaster confined to one island. It was a planetary event that reshaped the atmosphere of the entire Earth. And the eruption itself was only the opening act, because what Toba did to the sky in the years that followed is where this story turns genuinely frightening. When a supervolcano erupts at this scale, it doesn't just throw rock and ash into the air. It punches sulfur dioxide straight into the upper atmosphere, where it turns into a haze of reflective particles that wrap around the entire planet like a dirty curtain pulled across the sun. Picture what that actually looks like on the ground. Rivers that used to flood every season slow to a trickle, then crack into dry mud. Herds that have followed the same migration paths for generations arrive to find nothing waiting for them, and they don't survive long enough to learn a new route. Grasslands that once fed entire ecosystems turn brittle and brown under a sky the color of wet concrete. In the coldest stretches, frost creeps into regions that had never seen it before, killing crops overnight and forcing both animals and humans to move or starve. The sun itself, when it's visible at all, is reduced to a pale smear behind a haze that never seems to fully lift, day after day, year after year. This isn't a slow decline spread across generations. Some estimates suggest the worst of it played out over a handful of brutal years, fast enough that nothing alive had time to adapt. This is the exact stretch many scientists point to as the closest humanity has ever come to vanishing entirely. And the proof of just how close we came might be sitting inside your own cells right now. This is where the story stops being ancient history and becomes personal. Every person you've ever met, your parents, your closest friends, every celebrity, every politician, every stranger you've ever passed on the street may trace their ancestry back to a group small enough to fit inside a single sports stadium. That's not poetic exaggeration. It's written directly into human DNA. Modern humans are remarkably similar to one another genetically, far more uniform than other great ape species, despite having a vastly larger global population today. That kind of similarity is a red flag to geneticists. It suggests the human population crashed dramatically at some point in our past, wiping out genetic variation before slowly rebuilding it as numbers recovered. Scientists call this a population bottleneck. In the late 1990s, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose proposed that the timing of this genetic squeeze lined up almost perfectly with the Toba eruption, somewhere between 70 and 75,000 years ago, and that the eruption's climate effects could have crashed the global human population down to as few as several thousand breeding individuals. Not millions, not even hundreds of thousands, a few thousand people standing between our species and oblivion. But here's the twist quietly reshaping this entire theory, because not every scientist agrees the eruption is what actually nearly killed us. If Toba really did plunge large parts of the world into ash and darkness for years, you'd expect the archaeological record to show a wasteland around that exact time: abandoned settlements, vanishing tools, unmistakable signs of collapse. Instead, researchers digging at Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa found something almost defiant. Layers of Toba's volcanic ash, confirmed through microscopic glass shards called cryptotephra, sit directly within and around layers of human tool use that show no real interruption. People were living at this site before the eruption, during the ashfall, and after it, with no obvious gap in occupation. Picture grey ash drifting down like dirty snow over a coastline where people are still cracking open shellfish on the rocks, going about their lives as though a sky falling apart somewhere else didn't concern them at all. These weren't a handful of desperate stragglers either. The evidence points to a community using sophisticated stone tools and relying on coastal resources like shellfish, a stable, calorie-dense food source that doesn't depend on sunlight, rainfall, or seasonal harvests the way farming or hunting does. While much of the world may have been choking on ash and shivering through years of artificial winter, a small population on the African coast appears to have simply kept living, eating, and surviving. And that single discovery is exactly why scientists today remain genuinely split on what really happened next. The idea that Toba nearly wiped out humanity isn't settled science. Critics argue the genetic bottleneck could have other explanations entirely: small founding groups splitting off during migration, regional climate stress with nothing to do with one eruption, or simply the limits of how scientists model ancient populations. Two events lining up in time doesn't prove one caused the other. But defenders of the catastrophe theory point out that the coastal survivors at Pinnacle Point don't disprove a near-extinction event. They might just be the exception. Picture two groups living through the same disaster. One clings to a coastline littered with shellfish, a food source that never runs dry with the seasons, cracking open the same rocks year after year while barely noticing the catastrophe everyone insists nearly ended the world. The other follows herds across grasslands turning to dust, watching the same migration trails come up empty season after season until there's nothing left to follow. One group survives largely intact. The other might have been erased almost entirely. Toba may not have wiped out humanity everywhere, but it could have come devastatingly close almost everywhere except for a few lucky coastlines. The debate isn't over, and new ash deposits and genetic models keep reshaping the picture every few years. 74,000 years ago, one volcano may have reduced all of humanity down to a few thousand survivors, scattered, starving, surrounded by ash-grey skies and dying herds. If that's true, then every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, is the descendant of one of the luckiest human beings who ever lived. Somewhere in that handful of survivors was someone who refused to give up, who found food when there shouldn't have been any, who outlasted a disaster that should have ended us before it started. That person is the reason you exist, scrolling through a video about a disaster they never knew they survived. So if this blew your mind even a little, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more human history buried in places you'd never think to look.